dark night of regeneration? Every morning you need the sun to charge separate water in your body to create the battery that creates your life. That life is created by a cadre of photochemical that do things we all rely on. You need to expose all your surfaces to this signals to make sense of the world around you. The food and exercise gurus that keep bathing in blue light and never see this message, and blame foods and a lack of exercise for their ills. This blog shows you what you might miss when you focus only on food. Make like the Sphinx. While meditating in the morning sun, look to the east and ground and remain as connected to this environment as you can, and food will never be your main driver. Light, water, and magnetism works to limit food influence at the confluence of your mitochondria. It's that simple Rx to regenerate. Melatonin needs the sun's signal via neuropsin to regenerate our tissues. The second messengers in this system are triplet state free radicals created from mitochondrial respiratory proteins. These limit ELF-UV release from cells. Is melatonin really a solar story too? Most people think melatonin is our dark hormone. That is true, but few know that UV light is what regenerates the melatonin cycle in us. Melatonin teaches us a great many things about all the proteins in us that are biogenic amines that also work with sunlight in novel ways. Those proteins are melatonin, serotonin, melanin, and dopamine. They all use the sun in some very complex and counterintuitive ways. The end result of this transaction for all four is to deliver energy to mitochondria in a novel way. How it happens is the unfolding story in this blog, but it is based around how life works at the smallest levels in a cell. When a photon interacts with the particles in our cellular components on our globe, it lifts one electron from an electron pair in atoms in our molecules to a higher excited level. This excited state as a rule has but a short lifetime, and the electron drops back within 10 to 10 seconds to the ground state, giving off its excess energy in one way or another. Life has learned to catch the photon or electron in its excited state, and then act to uncouple it from its partner and let it drop back to the ground state through its biological semiconductors, utilizing its excess energy for life processes. Melatonin is a chemical that makes sure this process is orderly. In this sense, you can begin to see how living organisms are organized. This makes sure that all forms of life are never at the mercy of their environments, on account of the coherent energy stored within them. Plants and animals use the power of the sun in different subtle ways. This explains why animals don't have to eat constantly, leaving plenty of time for many other useful activities of daily living. It also explains why fat evolved in animals as a store for the sun energy, so they could uncouple their metabolisms and burn fat to liberate heat when the sun quality was poor. This is why people are getting fatter today. We are creating a low quantum yield world, and we just do not see it. This allowed animals to live disconnected from the earth and sun for a period of times. This benefit was not afforded to trees and plants, who are 100% connected to the earth by their roots and the sun with their leaves and canopies. Fat mass allows animals to return entropy back to the environment while providing energy when food is not present. Food is only important to life when it is disconnected from earth, sun, and water for long stretches. The sun excites electrons to allow life to move. Nothing happens in life until something moves. It turns out melatonin slows many things in nature down. Slowing atoms down allows melatonin cleans up the mess that living makes in sunlight to help it regenerate. Melatonin is highly fat-soluble while also being soluble in water, making it the ideal soldier for free radical scavenging anywhere in a cell. Things that interact with sunlight tend to be fat-soluble, and those that interact in darkness tend to be water-soluble. When life is organized to store energy, no part of the system needs to be pushed or pulled into action, nor is it subject to mechanical regulation and control. Instead, it allows for coordinated action of all the parts. It is subject to timing, and it depends on rapid intercommunication throughout the system. The cell can thereby be thought of as a system of excitable media, tissues, or organs called excitable cells, poised to respond specifically and disproportionately to weak low electromagnetic signals. The excitable media is analogous to a dark mode plasma. Sunlight hitting tissues is how we are sensitized and animated to move electromagnetic currents in our dark mode state. Light is created from dark mode plasma only when resistance builds up to the solar plasma radiations. Since humans are made from a collection of semiconductive tissues, this is why living things remain in the dark mode. When any living media is stressed, it emits light and can be seen as ELF UV light release via a GDV camera or a photomultiplier. Semiconductors by their very nature have very low resistance because they can accept current and move it very easily. This is why doctors do not see light when they cut you open. Those excitable media are DHA, water, NADH, and collagen are called semiconductors buried in tissues in many places. We have massive thin ones in our skin, gut, lung, and blood. Our brain and heart are loaded with them too because both organs are energy hogs. Anytime energy is transformed, melatonin will be present locally. Energy in cells is neither created nor destroyed. It just changes shape under the power of sunlight, and melatonin makes sure the shapes of things are maintained when sunlight is absent. Water's molecule shapes are changed by light to become the molecular transformer of light's power to electric signals during day, and at night DHA changes the signal back to light when blue light is absent. Electromagnetic signals are the strongest forces in all of nature that bind the smallest particles in nature to innovate the most complex things in nature that live. Because large amounts of energy are stored everywhere in cells and tissues, they automatically amplify these weak electromagnetic signals to often cause macroscopic actions in other atoms and molecules to control entropy to allow life to manifest. Melatonin, first made in our RPE, skin, and blood plasma, all contain the ability to do these things in living things. Let us briefly review the multiple actions by which melatonin reduces the damaging effects of daylight's ability to make free radicals and reactive oxygen and nitrogen species. It is well documented that melatonin protects macromolecules from oxidative damage in all subcellular compartments. This is consistent with the protection by melatonin of lipids and proteins, as well as both nuclear and mitochondrial DNA. Melatonin achieves this widespread protection by means of its ubiquitous actions as a direct free radical scavenger and an indirect antioxidant. This is how it lowers heteroplasmy in mitochondria. What is heteroplasmy? A large number of pathogenic mtDNA mutations have been identified, and the more severe mutations are frequently mixed with normal mtDNAs within the cell, a state known as heteroplasmy. Heteroplasmic alleles can shift in percentage during both mitotic and meiotic cell division, leading to a potentially continuous array of bioenergetic defects, a process known as replicative segregation. As the percentage of mutant mtDNAs increases, the resulting bioenergetic defect becomes increasingly severe. Because different tissues have different bioenergetic thresholds, as a patient's bioenergetic capacity declines, it eventually falls below the minimum threshold for that tissue and symptoms ensue. Because the tissues and organs with the highest bioenergetic requirements are also those that are primarily affected in the common metabolic and degenerative diseases, it follows that mitochondrial dysfunction may be a major contributor to complex diseases. Women that harbor deleterious heteroplasmic mutations have a high probability of having affected children, the nature and severity of the phenotype depending on the mtDNA mutation and the percentage of heteroplasmy. Cells and individuals can accumulate an array of different mtDNA mutations over time, the aggregate of which degrade the energetic capacity of the cell. Such mutations are important in aging and cancer. Given the enormous potential explanatory power of heteroplasmic mtDNA mutations, it is striking that very little is known about the origin, genetics, and phenotypic effects of heteroplasmic mtDNA mutations. Intermittent fasting works because it raises melatonin levels. But intermittent fasting is only optimized when the time we are spent fasting is when we are connected to the solar cycles and the Earth's magnetic field. This can be extended if we add meditation to the mix. Thus, melatonin directly scavenges a variety of free radicals and reactive species, including the hydroxyl radical, hydrogen peroxide, singlet oxygen, nitric oxide, peroxynitrite anion, and peroxynitrous acid. Furthermore, melatonin stimulates a number of antioxidative enzymes, including superoxide dismutase, glutathione peroxidase, glutathione reductase, and catalase. Additionally, melatonin experimentally enhances intracellular glutathione levels by stimulating the rate-limiting enzyme in its synthesis, glutamylcysteine synthase. Melatonin also directly links to neuropsin function in the eye. Melatonin inhibits the PR0 oxidative enzymes nitric oxide synthase and lipoxygenase on our surfaces in the presence and absence of sunlight in novel ways. These two enzymes are key photochemicals in the skin. Melatonin and DHA are destroyed by artificial blue light after sunset. The brain contains two main polyunsaturated fatty acids, arachidonic acid and docosahexaenoic acid. These PUFA are located almost exclusively in the SN2 position of phosphoglycerides, which are found in the neural cell membranes. Liberation of these PUFA from the phosphoglycerides occurs via the action of specific phospholipases. Free AA can be metabolized by cyclooxygenases to prostaglandins and thromboxane, while both AA and DHA can be metabolized by lipoxygenases to form hydroxy derivatives and leukotrienes. AA is also metabolized to lipoxins via the 5-lipoxygenase pathway. The eicosanoids formed play important roles in neural function, including sleep induction, long-term potentiation, spatial learning and synaptic plasticity, resolution of inflammation and anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective bioactivity, dihydroxydocosahexaene, neuroprotectin D1, formed from DHA. COX inhibitors have been shown to reduce oxidative stress and cognitive impairment. Additionally, drugs which are used to treat depression have been shown to reduce the turnover of AA to PGE2 in the brain. Diets deficient in omega-3 PUFA lead to reduced DHA in the brain and increased turnover of AA to eicosanoids with lowered melatonin levels locally and globally in the human body. This is an effect which is overcome by restoring the omega-3 PUFA to the diet. In neural trauma and neurodegenerative diseases, there is a dramatic rise in the levels of AA-derived eicosanoids. In contrast, DHA-derived compounds can prevent neuroinflammation. Clearly, the eicosanoids are very important for the normal functioning of the brain, while the PUFA themselves are important in membrane structure and function. Both need to be present together. If the neuropsin-melatonin cycle is broken, eicosanoids cannot protect DHA, and this ruins the SCN clock and increases inflammation. Finally, there is evidence that melatonin stabilizes cellular membranes, especially around mitochondria DNA, thereby probably helping them resist oxidative damage. Most recently, melatonin has been shown to increase the efficiency of the electron transport chain and, as a consequence, to reduce electron leakage and the generation of free radicals. These multiple actions make endogenous melatonin a potentially useful agent in the treatment of neurological disorders that have oxidative damage as part of their etiological basis. Most neurodegeneration is associated with very altered melatonin cycles. This is why sleep is disrupted in these patients early on in their diseases. The precursor to melatonin is serotonin, a neurotransmitter that itself is derived from the aromatic amino acid tryptophan. Aromatic amino acids are relatively nonpolar. To different degrees, all aromatic amino acids absorb ultraviolet light. Tyrosine and tryptophan absorb more UV than do phenylalanine. Tryptophan is responsible for most of the absorbance of ultraviolet light at 280 nanometers by proteins in humans. Tyrosine is the only one of the aromatic amino acids with an ionizable side chain. Tyrosine is one of 3 hydroxyl-containing amino acids. 5-hydroxytryptophan is the base molecule for serotonin that eventually forms melatonin in tissues. UV light is critical in this dance, just as it was for tyrosine and UV light and dopamine creation. Melatonin is a UV tryptophan story that links to serotonin. UV light at 337 nanometers is capable itself of photoactivation of the 5-hydroxytryptophan decarboxylation reaction producing serotonin. This has been observed in many experiments. The photoactivation effect was investigated as a function of fluence rate and fluence, and pH. pH links the photochemical effects to protons because it affects the exclusion zone in water. The exclusion zone affects the charge separation in water. CSF carries a lower pH at dusk after being oxidized all day by light's effects on our tissues. Photoactivation of decarboxylase activity was found to occur at nearly neutral pH values. The findings indicate that the effect of light is similar to a pH shift toward the acid region, which causes the enzyme conversion from the inactive to active form. Here you see why I believe a low acid pH is needed to make melatonin from serotonin properly at night when light is missing from striking our surfaces from the environment we allow. The 337 nanometers light is likely the critical frequency in the small bowel that controls quorum sensing in the microbiome. I am sure this frequency is also important in the photochemical actions of the superior cervical ganglion and within the CNS. Pyridoxal phosphate is the decarboxylase cofactor. In the form of an adduct-absorbing protein, it is optimized at 330 to 340 nanometers. This is why it has been suggested as a candidate for the role of the photoactive chromophore of decarboxylase reaction critical in melatonin synthesis. 90% of all serotonin is produced by the microbiome in our gut. It does not come from food as most believe. Remember, bacteria release massive amounts of light. That light and the aromatic amino acids in serotonin are what make the gut our melatonin factory for the brain. So how does the gut link to the brain? An environment with a low quantum yield is a huge problem for the regeneration pathways. The natural fix is in the eye. Neuropsin melatonin appears to the guardian of the mitochondrial genome of 13 genes. All of these genes code for the proteins that tunnel electrons and spit protons out of the mouth of cytochrome proteins. The mitochondrial genome undergoes 3 times as many genomic mutations as the nuclear genome by design. Melatonin levels are critical in monitoring this behavior. The major function that melatonin helps smooth in mitochondria are energy metabolism and flux via control of electron and proton tunneling. Redox balance within the mitochondria, ion homeostasis, the signaling of cell death and mitophagy equals percent heteroplasmy in a mitochondria. Are dreams a clinical sign of mitochondrial heteroplasmy? Might dreaming be tied to the harvesting of serotonin stores being converted to melatonin? I think so. Might dreams be a photoelectric spark tied to the 337 nanometers ELF UV light from cells after the absence of light for 2 to 4 hours? Yep. Might the lack of dreaming be a sign of a poor conversion because of some type of light pollution from the eye and gut to slow energy metabolism in our mitochondria? I think so. This is why I told you in the Leptin RX to not eat after dinner and not to eat after 7 p.m. Not only is poor sleep a sign of stunted longevity, but it causes an altered regeneration in all cell lines. This is associated with a lower DC electric current during daylight and an absence of dreaming at night. Might lack of dreaming be due to a lack of energy loss from light from mitochondria in some way? Might too much UV light release from cells chronically also lead to symptoms as poor dream creation? I think so. Why do I think this? The major store in the body of serotonin is found within the first 20% of the small intestine. Peripheral serotonin is produced in the digestive tract by the interaction of the microbiome and enterochromaffin cells. It is modified by particular types of immune cells and neurons. After 4 hours of darkness, the gut should quiet its motor function and begin releasing ELF-UV to command this conversion of serotonin to melatonin, provided there is no photonic interruption from extraneously light via the eye or gut surfaces. I would remind you, light is released from the microbiome when there is movement in the small bowel or we eat. This is why in sleep phases we have small gut paralysis. I believe the serotonin is harvested and decarboxylated to melatonin that will fill up our portal circulation to help reload our circulatory system and WBCs with melatonin. The melatonin made in the brain needs serotonin from the gut to travel via our vagus nerve and autonomic plexus to reach the pineal by way of the superior cervical ganglion. This only occurs when peristalsis is absent and blue light is absent from the retina in the 400 nanometers to 480 nanometers range. When it is not absent, you don't dream well. If it persists, you won't sleep well either. Within the pineal gland, serotonin is acetylated when blue light is absent from the central retinal pathways. Simultaneously, the gut is quiescent. Cells in the CNS are actively releasing ELF-UV to signal the conversion of serotonin to melatonin for sleep induction. This light UV frequency is likely to be critical in the methylation of serotonin substrates to yield melatonin. Sleep always begins in stage 1. Might this be why during this initial stage of sleep we experience strange and extremely vivid sensations or a feeling of falling followed by sudden muscle contractions? Might those contractions be due to a change of frequency occurring in mitochondrial oscillations? My June 2016 webinar has some interesting thoughts on this. Could this be serotonin substrates altering our consciousness by altering ELF-UV light release? Could these muscle changes be phenotypical responses of how we move from the photochemical stage of sleep dominated by CSF pH changes to photoelectric control in the absence of light to alkalize the pH and stimulate the release or ELF-UV light from cells to make melatonin? I think so. During this time cells are ketotic. This raises NAD, while improving electron chain transport speeds, which increases tunneling speeds of electrons from our fat stores. This is why melatonin is associated with higher tunneling speeds in mitochondria. As tunneling speeds increase, more oxygen is drawn to the terminal aspects of mitochondria, demolishing pseudohypoxia. This increases their magnetic flux. Oxygen is drawn to mitochondria at this time because oxygen is paramagnetic and all things paramagnetic are drawn to a magnet. During these speed-up phases during the initiation of sleep, mitochondria are known to create a superoxide burst at cytochrome 1 to lower the heteroplasmy percentage in mitochondria. This regenerates tissues with mitochondria and pushes cells further from illness. These reactions in stage 1 sleep are known as hypnagogic hallucinations. This is how life regenerates in quantum fashion, in my opinion. Melatonin controls local hormones that control the local effects of light. How? Melatonin is known as a neurohormone because it is produced in the blood plasma by white blood cells and within the pineal gland that regulates sleep and circadian functions. Melatonin also regulates inflammatory and immune processes, acting as both an activator and inhibitor of these responses. Melatonin demonstrates endocrine, but also paracrine and autocrine effects in the leukocyte compartment of blood. On one side, leukocytes respond to melatonin in a circadian fashion. On the other side, leukocytes are able to synthesize melatonin by themselves. With its endocrine and paracrine effects, melatonin differentially modulates pro-inflammatory enzymes, it affects leptin sensitivity, it controls production of inflammatory mediators such as cytokines and leukotrienes, and regulates the lifespan of leukocytes by interfering with apoptotic processes in cells and mitophagy in mitochondria. Moreover, its potent antioxidant ability allows scavenging of oxidative stress in the inflamed tissues that interest me most. Melatonin is an amazing biogenic amine. The interesting timing of pro- and anti-inflammatory effects, such as those affecting lipoxygenase activity, suggests that melatonin might promote early phases of inflammation on one hand and contribute to its attenuation on the other hand, in order to avoid complications of chronic inflammation. Human lipoxygenases are known by their shorthand name called LOXs enzymes. Why am I spending so much time explaining these linkages? Melatonin meets DHA LOX enzymes are how we recycle DHA into things that are highly anti-inflammatory secondary messengers called icanosoids. Icosanoids are the local secondary signal transducers that have a major impact on human homeostasis and energy balance. Melatonin recycling controls their creation. In this way, melatonin is the gateway neurohormone between regeneration and inflammation. For this reason, they are involved in many disease processes such as inflammatory responses, cancers, cardiovascular and kidney diseases, neurodegenerative disorders, and metabolic syndrome. This is how melatonin modulates things in our CNS and especially in our retina. It does the same thing on all our surfaces where sunlight impacts cellular components. This is why I have been aiming for quite some time at giving you a comprehensive overview of how biogenic amines control various inflammatory pathways. Melatonin regulates all our biogenic amines, making it a pleiotropic hormone. Melatonin has many different functions in light and dark environments. It used to be the boss of cells until big brains were invented by evolution. Melatonin is the protector of DHA stores in cell membranes and the protector of our mitochondria DNA. It is where the rubber meets the road in human biology. Before leptin evolved to specifically control energy balance and fecundity, melatonin was the gatekeeper hormone of the central nervous system of eukaryotes. Melatonin still is boss over mtDNA but not over nuclear DNA. In higher eukaryotes, leptin now modulates nuclear control factors we call epigenetics. Melatonin is more like a former head of state. It wields incredible control over growth and metabolism programs because of its linkages to light and darkness. This makes melatonin a chameleon, like hydrogen, like water, like sunlight frequencies. It is a jack of all trades and master of none. In science, we call this behavior pleiotrophy. Pleiotrophic equals a chemical or gene capable of producing more than one effect, especially having multiple phenotypic expressions. This chemical can open the door to heaven or hell if it is not controlled properly. Melatonin is the most pleiotropic hormone life has. Outside of leptin, no neurohormone is more important to life remaining metastable. How does the retina transmit information about light-dark exposure to the pineal gland to affect melatonin coupling? Light exposure to the retina is first relayed to the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, an area of the brain well known to coordinate biological clock signals. Is there another way to transmit light from outside in that melatonin links to in some way we are not aware? Yes. Neuropsin pathways have now been found. I first publicly mentioned neuropsin in September of 2015. Neuropsin light sensors send light info from our skin and eye to our hypothalamus. Fibers from the hypothalamus descend to the spinal cord and ultimately project to the superior cervical ganglia, from which postganglionic neurons ascend back to the pineal gland where the mother lode of melatonin awaits to clean up the mess a day creates in our brain. Thus, the pineal gland is similar to the adrenal medulla, in the sense that it transduces signals from the sympathetic nervous system into a hormonal signal. Key melatonin effect. Melatonin is the key control light hormone that protects the mitochondrial DNA. You won't hear that from a food guru. I found this from the work of mitochondria pioneer Dr. Doug Wallace about 10 years ago. I was stunned. This means melatonin is the photochemical gatekeeper of the percent of heteroplasmy in mitochondria in a cell. It controls inflammation, but it also controls turnover of DHA in our cells. This complex dance begins in the eye, at the RPE, where ocular melatonin begins its magic by using AM light to regenerate the melanopsin receptors in broad daylight using UV and IR light. They are only present together in daytime when we do not need to use the melanopsin receptors. So how does all this couple to circadian signaling? Humans created fashion, civilization, and vanity, and this is why just being human as we were when we fell out of a vagina has become so unpopular. Can just covering our skin and our eyes have tremendous power of the diseases we get? Can this be exacerbated by modern technology and blue light at night? I think so. Oh, so you still think sunglasses, clothing, and sunscreen are good modern humans? I am going to show you how these modern ideas directly destroy everything that controls the circadian coupling in every cell in your body. Alteration of light and dark cycles on our surfaces directly affects the SCN in our eye because of how light interacts on the RPE of the retina. This clock then controls and orders the peripheral clocks in our cells. Melatonin and vitamin D3 cycles must yoke properly together to work our circadian clocks in the brain and peripheral clocks correctly. Today this situation rarely happens naturally as it should because the quantum yield of the sun has been altered by our modern civilization's creations. Those creations no longer allow our surfaces to accurately sense or match the sun's frequencies or the angle of inclination based upon our location in our latitude or altitude. This has happened because of the ubiquitous effects of NN-EMF from technology and the fake blue light. They form constructive and destructive wave forms that interfere with incoming signals from our star. It also interferes with the low-frequency pulsations from the Earth's magnetic field. Consider nature's lessons carefully here. What does full-spectrum sunlight in the later morning naturally destroy in our skin and circulatory system naturally in us? UVA light shows up in late AM and earlier than UVB light, which shows up closer to midday. All frequencies of UV light from the sun naturally lowers adrenaline. Adrenaline is the stress hormone of the sympathetic nervous system. It is a catecholamine. Adrenaline is the main hormone secreted by the adrenal medulla in humans. The morning sun also has another major effect that is lost in many diseases. Initial sunlight at sunrise unzips collagen in cells to allow water to flow between glial cells and neurons to stretch the space to wake us up. This water flow has to be controlled. In seizure disorders and MS cases, this control is altered because melatonin cycles no longer exert control of the human LOX enzymes that control icanosoids that control the aquaporin for water gates in the brain and retina. Control of water allows us to slow light down to create a biologic timepiece. The morning light contains photons that are designed to rezip collagen that was initially unzipped by the energy in light. That light release controls cortisol release that occurred several hours earlier in the dark at 4 a.m. This is from ELF UV light release that is controlled by the melatonin cycles I mentioned above. That cortisol that wakes us up by allowing water flows to occur between glial cells and neurons via the aquaporin for gates in the brain and eye. This is why light stimulates seizures in many epileptics and why the most common presenting symptom in MS is an ocular abnormality. This linked directly back to altered melatonin control in the eye and the brain. The sunrise brings AM light, but this light initially has no UVA or UVB present. It has blue, green, and red present and is quite balanced. It has more blue than any other part of the spectrum, and this is highly stimulatory to water flows and helps in alerting us and waking us up. This light also is the initial stimulus to anterior pituitary hormone release. Naturally, UVA light shows up later in the morning. This light begins to limit hormone release from the anterior pituitary gland. The time this occurs depends upon your location in latitude, and in latitude if you live over 5,000 feet up where UV light will show up at earlier times. This is why the world's best sprinters, running backs, and ski racers all come from high UV environments. They usually have the most brisk hormone release followed by a massive surge in dopamine creation to build muscle for fast twitch action. 19 of the top 20 NFL all-time running backs come from subtropical environments. The world's fastest man comes from Jamaica, and the world's best marathoner runners today come from Kenya, where they run close to naked and barefoot in equatorial sun. They have optimized hormone function but extremely optimized melatonin cycles in their eyes and tissues. Every AM these UVA frequencies of light act to begin to rezip the collagen in our skin and eyes and regenerate the melanopsin receptors in the retina. When we are missing UV and or IR light frequencies for any reason, the biogenic amines that are built photoelectrically and photochemically are not made properly, nor are they coupled to the cycles of light. When full-spectrum sunlight is absent from any surface in someone, sleep cannot be induced properly because melatonin is not being regenerated. Adenosine is a chemical signal that is generated during daylight as a byproduct from energy metabolism. This helps the ocular melatonin production in the eye, which directly affects the hypocretin neurons in the hypothalamus when darkness begins. Adenosine levels increase with the incident light signals, but as dusk comes, incident light falls, and this lowers adenosine and melatonin secretion begins. Any blue light at night blocks melatonin production by acutely raising adenosine levels. What else blocks cellular regeneration by circadian decoupling? Lack of full-spectrum solar exposure during the day is the most common reason and most overlooked issue in all of medicine these days. This is how adenosine rises, and it is when melanopsin receptors are being recycled. Proper ocular melatonin cycling requires that these two frequencies be present to stimulate the regeneration processes in the eye during daytime. It also requires absence of blue 400 to 465 nanometers at sunset. When these things are off, the result always equals inflammation equals too many protons and or not enough electrons at the mitochondrial cellular level equals lowered melatonin levels in the eye, brain, blood plasma. If you think about your childhood, when you spent the day at the park of the beach, you might remember how easy it was to fall asleep and get a sunburn. The reason this situation is common should be simple to understand now. Sunlight can induce sleep because the regeneration pathways that use melanopsin need daylight to regenerate while acutely raising adenosine levels to very high levels. Those levels can signal sleep cycles in humans not normally used to full-spectrum light on a large portion of the body or in their eyes. When you do fall asleep, the redness of your skin really does not come from the UV light or the thermal burn as most believe. Instead, this comes from the increased blood flow to the surface of the skin because sunlight also releases massive stores of nitric oxide from our skin. Guess what can turn off NO release? Melatonin can do this if it is present because of its effect on nitric oxide synthetase. If it is not present in sufficient amounts, too much NO is released and we absorb massive amounts of UV and IR light in our blood plasma and in our RBCs. This can overwhelm the system, and this is what usually causes the severe burns when people fall asleep at the beach. Falling asleep at the beach is also a pretty good sign that this person lives in a light-stressed environment at night or during the day. The most common causes is blue light from indoor living. Normally, NO release is well controlled by melatonin in our WBCs. NO acts to bring the arterioles of the dermis layers to the surface to absorb UV light. UV light cannot penetrate skin deep at all. The same is not true for blue or red light, which is deeply penetrating to human tissue. This release of NO is a natural photochemical change induced by sunlight to allow the skin to absorb the UVA and UVB light at the surface. In diseases like MS, NO is lacking in the skin and melatonin is also lacking in our WBCs and in our eyes to drive the ocular melatonin cycles. UVA light penetrates deeper than UVB light can, so this is why vitamin D levels are disrupted in people with altered melatonin cycles in the eye and brain. Poor sleep and dreaming is a sign of a light-stressed human. To absorb the UV light to replace the ELF-UV all cells released to signal properly, we need the circulatory system to come from the dermis because UV light does not penetrate skin more than a millimeter. The NO engorges and vasodilates the arterioles containing the RBCs. The RBCs are filled with hemoglobin and porphyrins that absorb both UV and IR frequencies. Form meets function photoelectrically in this process. The sunburn is really an absorption of too much thermal IR energy and not the UV energy in sunlight. UV toxicity is usually related to time exposure in the sun on an acute basis in a person not normally used to being in the sun. Often they live indoors in an altered spectrum, and this is the real problem. When you are out of the sun, you develop anemia and lowered melanin levels and altered skin thickness. You become ill-equipped to deal with sunlight. Doctors and patients often blame the problem on the sun, when in reality it is caused from chronic exposure to an alien spectrum, and it is not a UV phenomena at all. It is based upon your sun callus, your skin type, your RBC status, and the amount of melatonin in our WBCs. Did you know that WBCs make melatonin using neuropsin? Might this be why Becker found leukemia develops in areas where NNEMF is? It is well known that NNEMF lowers melatonin levels. It is also well known that blue light penetrates deep into the dermis of the skin and destroys melatonin levels locally. Would surface-level blue light uncouple melatonin from neuropsin? Neuropsin responds to UVA and violet blue light. Check the links below. Might surface blue light somehow select for more immature WBCs to photochemically block how WBCs obtain their neuropsin light detector? Might neuropsin not be expressed until late into WBC's development to cause this problem? Isn't gene expression controlled by circadian biology? Does blue light somehow block peripheral circadian clocks? Yep. WBCs form deep inside of our bone marrow where other blood cells develop. Human neuropsin is closely related on a molecular basis to kallikreins. Protease inhibitor -6 is a potent inhibitor of the monocyte granulocyte protease cathepsin G in WBCs, which is stored in azurophilic granules and then released into phagocytomes or secreted during inflammation. PI6 is present in epithelial cells, endothelial cells, myeloid cells, and platelets, all of which form in bone marrow. Interesting. Coincidence, huh? Didn't Dr. Robert O. Becker also show that the periosteum of bone works photoelectrically in several of his key experiments? Yep. So how might these facts link to sunburns in the skin and blood plasma? Deep sunburns usually result from several factors: excessive sun, low melatonin in WBCs, anemia, dehydration, thin skin lacking melanin, thick skin, or a poor adaptation to seasonal light due to chronic use of UV blocking makeup, clothing, or sunblock use in strong light cycles. Today, humans bury the sun chronically and get diseases caused by inflammation. The sun is not the cause of our problems, no matter what the paradigm's current beliefs are. All modern humans, however, are afflicted today by altered light spectrums since we began wearing clothes and using fire at night. We began wearing clothes 700,000 years ago. Use of fire likely goes back even further. These likely were the first ways our species affected circadian signaling in our skin and eyes.
I believe